Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. He goes by the Sage of Quay, Quay. He's also known as Mike Williams, and a great scholar. Really, I call him a scholar about the Beatles, and so much about the Beatles, not just about Paul and Fall, but so many other things. And I was trying to get around his arms around all his research. It was very hard, but I listened to a lot of his shows on YouTube, and you'll see his website here. So I'll put a link to his website, sageofquay.com, and also his YouTube channel. And just amazing stuff about the Beatles. And I've titled this one, The Masonic Machinery Behind the Creation of the Beatles, because it's such an interesting phenomenon. And as growing up as a Beatles fan, you go back, White Album and so many influences, but I never think what's going on behind the curtain, so to speak. And there's a lot going on. There's a lot about the Beatles, and Mike knows a lot of it. And I've come across so many of his talks just researching myself, like some of these he's just one of those people who always keeps popping up with the Beatles. Like I pop back around. But he said we were talking in the pre-show, 8 years of research into the Beatles, but he can talk more about that. So Mike Williams, welcome to the show.
William, thank you so much for the invite.
Yeah, so for people who may not have heard of you or the Sage of Quay or all your research, maybe you can just kind of introduce people to how you got started looking into the Beatles and this amount of research and interviews you've collected over the last 8 years.
Well, I should start by saying that growing up, I was a Beatle freak. And I was born in 1959, and as early as 1968, I was on my parents to take me to the movie theater to go see Yellow Submarine. That's how much I knew about the Beatles at the age of 9. And my brother is just a little younger than I am, about 13, 14 months younger, and he was a little Beatle freak himself. So my father took the both of us to go see Yellow Submarine. I remember that not knowing as a kid, I didn't realize that it was an animation. So I was a little disappointed. Dad was in total pain the whole time because the Beatles were not his thing. But he was a real trooper. He sat there for 90 minutes. And it wasn't until the Beatles came out toward the end of Yellow Submarine that my brother and I really lit up. The Beatles were the reason why I picked up a guitar, why I started to write music, record music. I loved the Beatles. And then what happened was, if I just go back to high school, move forward in time a little bit, I knew about and heard of the Paul is Dead conspiracy, but I just thought, like many people, that it was nonsense and that it was nothing more than a clever marketing ploy by the Beatles to sell more records. And in fact, when the Paul is Dead rumor came out in 1969, record sales did tick up. So it did do that as well. But I didn't buy the whole Paul is Dead thing. I thought it was crazy, and Paul has always been Paul. And even in high school, what I did, even though I didn't believe the conspiracy, I was very intrigued by the clues. My high school was very progressive back in the day, and they allowed the students to bring in guest speakers. And so I brought in the brother of a friend of mine, Doug. Doug was about 5 years older than I was, and he knew everything about the Paul is Dead conspiracy, all of the clues on the album, the backmasking on the songs and all that. And so I brought Doug in to do the presentation, and I didn't think there was going to be a whole lot of people to show up in the classroom. By the time Doug got started, it was standing room only. So that's how much I was into the Beatles. And then what happened in 2016, I read a book titled The Memoirs of Billy Shears. And I stumbled upon the book as I was perusing in Amazon. I don't even remember what it is I was looking for, but the book popped up as a recommendation. And because I was familiar with the conspiracy and the book is about Paul is Dead, I took a look at the write-up and I thought to myself, well, okay, let's take a look at this. I knew nothing about the book. I knew nothing about the author/encoder, Tom Harriet. And so I read the book in the early part of 2016. The book was first published in September of 2009, September 9th of 2009, so the triple nines. And as I was reading the book, William, I was taken back. I was trying to get my head wrapped around it because the details in the memoirs of Billy Shears, the information is so diametrically opposed to the official narrative that if you're somebody that is a Beatle fan or a Beatle freak, it's going to be quite a shock. But the one thing that struck me is that there was so much information and so much detail in the book that I had to take a step back and think, the only way this much information and detail can be in the book, it has to be coming from somebody who is either in the inner circle of the Beatles or from the person that is actually playing the role of Paul McCartney, and that would be Billy Shears. In the book, he gives us the name of William Shepherd. A shepherd is somebody that leads a flock. Others in the Paul is Dead Beatles conspiracy community will say that what they believe his name is William Campbell, but I call him Billy Shears because that's how he refers to himself. And in fact, he introduces himself to us on the Sgt. Pepper album after the title track, Sgt. Pepper plays, and that segues into With a Little Help from My Friends. And that segue, there's a lyric that says, and let me introduce to you the one and only Billy Shears. So that's an introduction to Billy. Even though Ringo sings the song, that's really a distraction. That's to keep the focus off of Billy, because a lot of people believe Billy Shears is Ringo because Ringo sang the song, but that's not what was going on there. It was a way to deflect, because when a lot of people looked at the Sgt. Pepper album when it first came out, and you'll hear this from a lot of Beatle fans, especially those that subscribe to my channel, they will say, well, the guy that's on the front cover of Sgt. Pepper in the blue costume, Paul McCartney, doesn't look very much like Paul McCartney. He looks very different. What they did was they did a couple of deflections. One was with the song With a Little Help from My Friends, having Ringo sing about being Billy Shears. But the other thing that they did with the album cover was to change the appearance of all of the Beatles. And so this way, it doesn't look like just one person looked very different, but they all looked very different with the longer hair, facial hair, and all of that. So what happened was I started reading the book, and I was very shocked by a lot of the information that was in it because it was diametrically opposed to the official narrative. And I could have done one of two things at that point. I could have just put the book down and say, well, this is just nonsense. I'm not going to give this any more of my time. Or let me take a look at this book and let me do some research and see if I can prove or disprove what it is that we're being told. And so I opted for option 2. And I didn't think I would be spending as much time as I did. As you mentioned when we got started, my research went 8 years, and I'm going to be retiring the research come this November. 8 years is long enough to do just about anything. As I got into it, I was finding that many aspects of many threads in the book were truthful, that I can look at it, I could assess it. The evidence was leading to a point where I had to start to admit to myself that this could very well be, that Paul McCartney was replaced, and that it's not just a replacement, because I've come to the point where the replacement of Paul McCartney is the subplot. The main plot to the whole Beatles psychological operation, which originated at the Frankfurt School and Tavistock, was to social engineer the world. The Beatles were the first created band with the mission to social engineer at a worldwide level. And their social engineering had to do with bringing in Aleister Crowley's Aeon of Horus, or what a lot of people would refer to as the Age of Aquarius. But I always have to put a little footnote next to that and explain that it's the elite or the controller's version of the Age of Aquarius, because everything they do is not natural or organic. They're just going to kind of force it through the pipeline. But in order to get all of this done, they had to alter significantly the landscape across the world, especially when it rolled into the United States, when the Beatles rolled in 1964, to break down traditional values and also to dismantle organized religion. And in particular, they had their sights. When I say they, I'm talking about Tavistock, the Deep State, the Committee of 300. They had their sights on Christianity. They had to dismantle Christianity in order to move forward with their, quote, New Age, or Crowley's Aeon of Horus. So the Beatles were missioned to do that. They were tasked to do that. And when I was doing the research, like I said, there's one piece of it, the subplot is Paul was replaced. but you really have to go back in time, and this is what I did, to understand what went on before Paul McCartney was replaced. And I'm sure there's many people listening saying, well, Paul McCartney was replaced. Yes, Paul McCartney was replaced. I won't get too much into it in this show because we're limited for time, but I would suggest going to my channel, Mike Williams' Paul is Dead channel. I have a video there, a short one, which is the Beatles Conspiracy 101. It's a minute long, and I'm pointing you to some links to help you get started and to ramp up and to get on board with the conspiracy if this is something that interests you. And I stopped calling it the Paul is Dead conspiracy. I started calling it the McCartney conspiracy and the Beatles conspiracy. But what I did, what a lot of other researchers did not do, was to go back in time. A lot of researchers will focus on Billy replacing Paul in late 1966 and then moving forward. Understanding the replacement and doing those comparisons and doing that analysis is very important. There's no question about it. That's basically step one when you get into this conspiracy. But I said, there had to be a whole lot of stuff that went on before we ever got to that point. And when I was reading memoirs, there's a blurb in the book on page 350 and 351. There was a narrative in the book, a few sentences that said that George Martin was going to take their little songs and make them great. Now, for those of you who don't know, George Martin was their producer, and George was known as the fifth Beatle. And George Martin plays a very, very important role in all of this. And then the book went on to talk about the snitch and the Committee of 300.
Wow. So the Committee of 300 is in the memoirs of Billy Shears?
It talks about it. So
wow,
this is the book here, the Committee of 300. The first book I read was the red cover. This is the blue-covered book. And aside from the narrative itself, it's loaded up with footnotes. And the footnotes are very, very revealing.
Wow. And it's no mistake that this name is a 5 and a 6, right? So you've got Tyler Durden, you've got Harry Potter, which is a whole nother cultural creation in itself, and a whole nother show. And then Billy Shears. Like, these are not a mistake. 5, 6, 11, it all adds up.
Yeah, and the book is 666 pages and 66 chapters. The other thing is there are many, many Beatles songs mentioned in the book, Beatle lyrics mentioned in the book. Billy's likeness is contained in the book. For those that don't know, you're really running a risk when you write a book and you put the lyrics to songs in a book without receiving permission from the copyright owner. Some people have questioned this and said, well, yeah, you could do that. I said, no, you cannot do that. And I verified that with 2 attorneys that I know. One is my personal attorney that does copyrights and trademarks, and the other one is a friend of the family's who's a criminal attorney. And I asked them both about, hey, if you're going to write a book, can you just put song lyrics in there? And they both came back and said, you shouldn't do it unless you have permission because you could wind up in a bind. At the very least, you'll wind up with a cease and desist order. Worst case is you can get sued. And I also ran this by a friend of mine who's in the music industry, and he's been in the industry for a very long time. He's out of the UK. He has written many, many songs for artists out of Europe. And when I talked to him about it, he said, Mike, I get requests all the time for people who are writing books to use my lyrics. And the first thing I want to know is, what are you using the lyrics for? In other words, what's the context? So if you're going to take my lyrics or my songs and you're going to put them in a context that is not helpful to me, in other words, it could be disparaging, then that's not going to work. I am not going to allow you to use my song lyrics. So what that says is, and for those that know who try to upload any kind of Beatle content to their YouTube channel and all that stuff, Apple shuts that stuff down right away. So there's no problem with Apple shutting anything down that is not approved by them. And Billy, the same thing. Paul McCartney's enterprise is huge, MPL Communications. So this book here, if Billy wasn't participating in this book, if he wasn't a source for this book, there was no question in my mind that the author/encoder, Tom U. Harriet, would have received, at the very least, a cease and desist order, which has never happened. In fact, as time goes on, the book is updated with additional information. And each time the book is updated, more and more details are given, more verifiable details are given, which shores up and proofs out that the book is truthful. Now, the reason why I say it's truthful is because the book is classified as historical fiction. The reason why it's classified as historical fiction is because Billy, the person playing the role of Paul McCartney, has signed agreements. He has NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, and other secrecy agreements that he has to abide by to play the role of Paul McCartney. And Tom Harriet also had to have signed an NDA. Now, the reason why I'm fairly positive that the author and coder Tom Harriet had signed an NDA is because going back in 2016, when I got done reading the book, I wanted to have Tom to come on my show because I was doing a lot of podcasting back in the day, and I wanted to talk to him about the book. So I reached out to him. Tom had gotten back to me, and he said, sure, I'll come on the show. I'll talk about the book. And then a week later or so, he emailed me and said, Mike, I can't do any interviews. And he didn't elaborate. But in my view, what happened was he had to go check with legal counsel. I'm pretty confident what happened was they said to him, look, you signed an NDA, and even if you say something innocently, you could have a problem if you say something that breaches the contract that you signed. So our recommendation is that you not do that you don't do these interviews. And to this day, Tom has not done any interviews on this book. Now, I'm trying to get him to come on my show, and going back about 2 months ago, he said that he might be at a point now where he will be able to talk about the book. Maybe. It's basically a waiting game to see at what point does he get the green light. So I'm reading the book, and it's historical fiction. There are threads of fiction in the book, but the book is layered. It's an encoded book. It's a Masonic book. Tom is a Freemason. Obviously, Billy is a Freemason. In fact, I believe Billy is in the Illuminated degrees these days. The book has a number of layers in it. The first layer is you just read the book the way it is. You just read from left to right as you would read any book, and you're going to get a lot of information just from doing that. The second layer has to do with what's referred to as word stacking. Now, Tom is an expert in encoding. So word stacking means that on each page of the book, there are certain words that are bolded out. So when you read the bolded out letters by themselves, they form sentences. And so now you're getting another layer of information from the book that may not necessarily be in the narrative if you just read the book like you would read any book. The third layer is what is referred to as the acrostical code. In the book, the first letter of every odd numbered sentence, when you start putting the letters together, it forms more words and more sentences. It's crazy stuff. It's crazy, crazy stuff. So that's the third layer. The fourth layer of the book, and these are layers that I have discovered, is that the book is actually inviting you to go outside the book and research it. If you included everything in the book that you wanted to know, it wouldn't be 666 pages. It would be 6,666 pages. So the book is actually inviting you to go outside to research. And that's exactly what happened to me when I read that passage on page 350 and 351, where it talked about George Martin making their little songs great, and then talking about the Committee of 300 and the Snitch. The Snitch was Dr. John Coleman.
Wow.
The fourth layer, if you want to call it a layer, I mentioned earlier, are the footnotes. The earlier versions of memoirs, going back to 2009, did not have footnotes. So periodically I would communicate with Tom, because the way the book is written, some of it is written, it's a little coy. So you have to read it a couple of times and you're wondering, does the book mean this or does it mean that? Today, I have a professional friendship with Tom. It's been 8 years. It's not like we're best friends. We go out to have beers and all that stuff. Every once in a while, I will reach out to Tom and I'll have some questions about the book. And he's always been very honest and very straightforward with me. Clearly, there are some things he cannot talk about. And if that's the case, he'll say, I can't talk about that. But if there's other information where he can expand upon what's in the book, he will do that. So I just want to say that. So the footnotes have become more and more revealing over time, very specific, doesn't leave a lot for interpretation. They're just right there for you to read. And recently, another layer was added to the book, which is which is called the whisper messages. Now, the whisper messages are not on every page of the book, but it's on a good number of the pages in the book. These are typed out sentences in very light font, so very almost subliminal in a way. And when you read the whisper messages, it's now adding even more information. So the conclusion is, that what I concluded is that the reason why the book is written this way, obviously, like I mentioned before, it's a Masonic book encoded by a Freemason, Billy being a Freemason himself, and as I mentioned, in all likelihood, in the illuminated degrees. But it's like a big puzzle. And so it's, if you're intrepid enough and you go through the book, all the information that you're really looking for is there. Sometimes, actually a lot of times, it's not easy to see that it's there. It takes a lot of time, a lot of diligence to sit down and to do research and investigation outside the book and start to put the pieces together. So this is what I have done over 8 years, and not just myself. I've connected William into a handful of other researchers, very, very smart people who also have been looking into the book and researching it. And over the 8 years, we have done presentations together. We have done roundtables together to talk about what it is that we discovered in the book, what information that we have proof of or evidence of, and to try to pull it all together.
Wow.
So that's the background on the book. And
didn't Billy Shears say that he studied under Crowley? Or
yes.
Something?
So
Yes,
in the book, it tells us that he was subjected to ritual abuse. And his earliest memory of that was at the age of 3. He said that he was tutored by Crowley for 10 years. So Billy was born in 1937. We know this because in the Magical Mystery Tour film, it drops a hint that he's actually 5 years older than he actually looks. That was his way of saying, I'm 5 years older than biological Paul. Biological Paul, when I say biological Paul, we're talking about the original Paul McCartney. I do believe he passed away in late 1966. So Billy was born in 37, and Crowley died in 1947. Now, the book also has passages that would have the reader lean toward the possibility that Crowley could be his biological father. And that could have occurred through any number of ways. What I mean is basically sex magic, because Crowley, as you probably know, William, was heavily into sex magic.
That's all he did.
It's all he did. And then when he took over the OTO, he made it a requirement in order to get to the higher degrees within the OTO.
It wouldn't be the only child that Crowley had. I mean, he had 5 known children.
Right. It's the known. We can look that up. It's how many are out there that.
Right. Well, I mean,
they're not
Barbara,
documented in Wikipedia.
Yeah. We can say Barbara might be the 6th, and maybe Billy Shears.
Yes, that's right. So the book leans in that direction, or tries to, I guess, kind of push it in that direction. And I had one of the researchers, Stacy, came on my show, and she did a phenomenal job of breaking down clues within the book, and she made a very compelling argument that he is not the offspring of Aleister Crowley, but his bloodline goes back to the Douglas Hamiltons and the Percy bloodline. This would be blue bloods out of Scotland. And it's too involved to get into here, but I have a presentation that I did with Stacy, and she'll walk everybody through it. It's very, very compelling. She did an excellent job. Now, I can't say with 100% certainty that, nor can Stacy, that she's absolutely correct on this, but I will say that it's the best case of evidence that I have seen to align Billy with somebody with regard to his ancestry, like his mother and father. So,
and it is important. J.K. Rowling says that she's just a simple, single mom, but she has part of the aristocracy of the UK. She keeps that real quiet. Interesting, Kay. She made up that letter just to make her name more interesting, the 11th letter of the alphabet. But the royal people in the U.S., they don't understand like the class system, and almost all of the aristocracy traces themselves back to the Battle of Hastings and William the Conqueror. They all go back there, and if you can trace that, you're like a blue blood. You truly are the highest levels of the aristocracy. So tracing yourself back to that, almost the entire aristocracy, landed aristocracy in England is traced back to William the Conqueror.
And these bloodlines, many of them, if not all of them, are attached to the occult, to occultism, to the esoteric, to mysticism. And I actually have an interview that Billy did. I forgot who the person is that was interviewing him. But during that interview, Billy states that as a child, he was taught to write his name backwards. This would fit very nicely with Aleister Crowley's law of reversal. There's a lot of clues, a lot of hints all around Billy and the Beatles, which point back to all of this occultism, in particular to Crowley, to the cult of Pan, to the cult of Dionysus, because this is where the controllers are taking us. I like to just refer to it as the cult of Pan. And the Beatles would be the Pied Pipers of Crowley's Aeon of Horus. Now, if we take a look at the Sgt. Pepper album cover, they're actually communicating this out to us. So the word Pied, and the Pied Piper is a play on Pan mythology. So we have to understand that first. Pied means multicolored. And take a look at the Beatles. They're in multicolored outfits. And Pan played the pan flute, a wind instrument. And if you look at the cover of Sgt. Pepper, all of the Beatles are holding wind instruments.
Interesting.
So what I did, William, was, which really shook the trees, was back in 2019, based upon that passage in the book on page 350 and 351 about George Martin making their little songs great and then talking about the Committee of 300. Now, I had not at the time read the book, the Committee of 300, but I was familiar with John Coleman because Dr. Coleman did interviews many years ago. And, I had listened to the interviews. I've been in the whole alternative research business for a long time. I started off as a blogger in 2011 or 2012, and the blog still runs to this day. So I was, looking at a lot of this stuff. So I said, okay, let me read the Committee of 300 now because the book is definitely leading me there. And what I did in this book, which is not about the Beatles, I should say that. It's about the deep state. It's about the Committee of 300. It talks about Tavistock. But in the book, Dr. Coleman states unequivocally that the Beatles were a creation of Tavistock. And this is mentioned maybe about 7 or 8 times in the book, depending upon the context in which he's discussing in a particular chapter. So then what happened was I said, well, I have to then, let's go take a look, a deep dive into the Frankfurt School and Tavistock. Because when you talk about Tavistock, you have to talk about the Frankfurt School. If you talk about the Frankfurt School, you got to talk about Tavistock because they're really connected at the hip. So what I've been showing folks, and I have nothing to do with these books, folks. I don't make any money on them. Just showing you what I read. Tavistock Institute by Daniel Estulin is a good book. It's a good primer to get started with. You have John Coleman's book on Tavistock, which is excellent. This is a very, very good book as well. So the Committee of 300, Coleman's book on Tavistock, Daniel Estulin's book on Tavistock. Another really good book is this one here, Secret Agent 666, by Richard Spence on Crowley and how Crowley was connected into British intelligence. And Crowley was in the elite system. A lot of people don't realize that. And we could talk about that a little bit because when we talk about the Aeon of...
That's all he was. He was from the apex of the class system.
Exactly.
At the height of the British Empire, so...
Yes, exactly. But a lot
of people...
He never
worked a day in his life. Never had a real job.
And, but a lot of folks, when they listen to Crowley and when he talks about the Aeon of Osiris, which is equivalent to the Piscean age, and moving to the Aeon of Horus, which would be equivalent to the age of Aquarius, going from an age of oppression and being shackled to a period of illumination and enlightenment where you pursue your true and pure will. Well, there are people, because I've had these conversations with people, they'll send me emails or put them in the comments section under the video, that when Crowley was talking about this stuff, he was talking about it on behalf of all of humanity. And I said, I don't think so. I think he was speaking specifically to his elite circle. And his religion of Thelema is what I believe is extremely prominent within the Pyramid of Power. That the vast majority of the controllers within the Pyramid of Power subscribe to his religion of Thelema. That's their their spiritual philosophy and ideology.
One of the things about Crowley people overlook is like he was a class person. He was of the highest class. He believed the slave shall serve. He thought the optimal political system was a feudal system,
Yes.
and that they should kill off all the Jews and Protestants. So when people say like it was for all of humanity, and he
Right.
called himself the priest to the princes, so he saw himself as like only, he said, have nothing to do with the muck of the mire, find diamonds and polish them. What he meant by that was nobody who's uneducated, just find the really smart ones and polish them. So people who say that he was some kind of egalitarian, it's just not in his writing or his conduct at all.
No, it's not. It's not. And you mentioned, and the slaves shall serve comes from his book 77.
Right. It comes from 77, but it's quoted. It's a direct quote from the Book of the Law.
So what I did was, I said, well, let me take a look at the Beatles' backstory from the very beginning. Let's just set aside this Paul McCartney being replaced bit, because honestly, William, it doesn't take very long, if you're critically thinking and you're objective, to see that they are two different people.
Yeah.
People want to argue with me on that, but I'm telling you, folks, they are not the same person. And Billy has been dropping clues that he's not Paul McCartney since day one. You just have to know to be aware when he's making those clues and what to look for.
The other members of the band do it too. Like you have it in your videos. Like, hey, Bill, hey, William. They're calling him William.
Oh,
Sorry that
yeah.
Paul's gone. I mean, they act like they know he's not alive. So they have these doubles. They have doubles of like Paul McCartney. There's no question about it. Like you said, there's one that plays music and the one that shows up for interviews.
One of the best clips, which is very straightforward, is there was the premiere for the concert for George, which was a tribute concert for George Harrison. You know, Billy showed up for that, and he, at the time, he was married to Heather Mills. Olivia Harrison and George's son, Danny, were there. And so Olivia says to Billy, she greets him, and she says, hello, Billy. And he gives her a hug. And it's very clear. She said, hello, Billy. So these clues are out there. Honestly, when somebody greets somebody by their name, I'm not even sure that's a clue.
Right. It's just like, you just stay like casually.
If I met you, I would say, hello, William.
Yeah.
It's not mysterious. That's your name. Or if you said, hello, Mike. So it's out there. And like I said, folks, I have 8 years of this under my belt, and there's over 300 videos. So if you're interested, take a look. I step you through a lot of facets of the conspiracy, and there are many. What I wanted to do was to go back, and I took a look at the Beatles timeline, William, between 1960 and 1963. And the reason why I did that was because that was the timeline that was leading up to the Beatles arriving in America. So they arrived in America on February 7th of 1964. February 7th, 1964 is a 9/11 encoded date. February is the second month. It was the seventh day. 2 plus 7 is 9. And then 1964. So in numerology, 9, you can treat it like 0, because anything times 9 reduces to 9, just like anything times 0 equals 0. So 1964, 1 plus 9 plus 6 plus 4, or 1 plus 0 plus 6 plus 4 is 11. So February 7th of 1964 is a 9/11 encoded date. And we see a lot of numerology, a lot of occult numbers around the Beatles. A lot of 3s, 6, 9s, 11s, 33s, 7s, double 7s, triple 7s, the 6s, 66, triple 6s, 9, 99s, and the triple 9s. All around the Beatles. They really, really loved the number 7, and that was embedded in their albums, especially their first 7 albums, and as well as the Sgt. Pepper album. And I can explain that in a little bit. Now, the number 7 refers to, it's the number of perfection and higher spiritual consciousness. And the Beatles, one of their jobs was to put forth this concept of evolving to higher spiritual levels of consciousness or enlightenment or illumination. And again, if I have some time, I can get into that. If I don't, I cover all of this on my YouTube channel. So anyway, the first thing that I took a look at is, when did the Beatles really get started, right? So, before I get into that, let me just mention this. I have speculated that it's very possible that the Beatles, and I focus mostly on John Lennon and Paul McCartney, because they were the, quote, primary songwriters, that they may have been in mind control programs. And why do I say that? Well, first of all, if we take a look at the family situations, both Paul and John lost their mothers at an early age. John was raised by his Aunt Mimi. His father, Freddie, was missing in action. He was nowhere to be found. In the book, in memoirs, it tells us there was an uncle. Doesn't mention who the uncle is, that his uncle sponsored him, which means got him into a program and got him into the pipeline. It also tells us in the book that Paul McCartney's father, Jim, once his mother passed away, once Paul McCartney's mother, Mary, passed away, that Jim was leading him away from Christianity. And I was looking at that as possible table setting for what was going to happen in the future for Paul, as far as being in the pipeline, the Tavistock pipeline, to be groomed and handled along with the rest of the band to wind up doing what they did. So with these mind control programs, I mean, it's not always the case, but a lot of times what we'll see is broken families. Parents are not there. Parents die young, or mother dies young. It's dysfunctional. There's not a cohesiveness to the family. And many times these types of situations, the kids are ripe for these types of programs to be brought into them. Now, that itself, somebody could argue and say, well, that's just speculation. And it is. I said it's speculation. But also what we have on the internet, if you look, you're going to see images of Paul McCartney and George Harrison with bird cages on their heads. And there's another image of John Lennon in a Superman shirt, and he has his head leaning up against the bird cage. Now, bird cage in Illuminati occult symbolism refers to mind control, a mind control slave. And I get the argument many times that, well, I don't think they knew what they were doing, or it doesn't matter whether they knew what they were doing. And in all likelihood, they were not aware of what was really going on, or to the extent of what was really going on. And when they were asked to do certain things, like put a bird cage on their head, they may not have understood what that meant. But what's going on there is the controllers are communicating out. There you go. There's the one with John Lennon with the Superman shirt, and then the bird cage.
You have to remember, these guys are in their 20s when all this is happening. So
early 20s.
How sophisticated they are is real up for debate, I would say.
Yeah. And the Superman shirt is a reference to the Übermensch. This is something that Nietzsche spoke about. It's the superhuman. And of course, this is what the controllers are all about. They're looking to create a superhuman. When we talk about transhumanism, Yuval Harari talking about and making declarations like they've achieved godlike status, and they're going to do that with their technology and all that stuff. This is what they're referring to. So all of this always goes back in time. Their table setting goes back decades. And then it's a very methodical, incremental march forward based upon social engineering, redefining values and ethics and morals and lifestyle, quite frankly. So people start to assimilate these changes, and it becomes part of their reality or culture. And what I've explained to my audience is what the controllers have done through Tavistock and the Frankfurt School is to deliver to us pop culture, popular culture. Pop culture is something that was fabricated for us to operate in, to keep us detached from our ancestral traditions and culture. They have to eradicate that stuff. So if you're from Spain, you have a Spanish culture, German, a German culture, Italian, Mexican, a Mexican culture. And so what they want to do is to remove that. They don't want you to have these ancestral ties back to your culture. They want a homogenized hive mind state. And pop culture does that. And what is pop culture? Pop culture it's Netflix, it's hot dogs, hamburgers, beer, and ball games. That's pop culture. And they have their Pied Pipers out there. I talked about the Beatles being the Pied Pipers of the Eon of Horus. But all of your celebrities, your entertainers, your bands, your artists, they are all Pied Pipers because you're following them. And people worship
their
entertainers
culture,
or their celebrities.
Yeah.
And the Beatles are a cult. I was in that cult, folks. I had a front row pew in the church of the Fab Four. I was in that cult. And believe me, it's not an easy pill to swallow to break the programming into conditioning, because we have to look at it this way. The conditioning with regard to the Beatles' official narrative telling us what the Beatles were, which they were not, has been going on for 6 decades, for 60 years. So for 60 years, we've had it pounded into our heads. The Beatles were geniuses.
Right.
They were these great songwriters. And anytime you ever watch a documentary or you read a piece on the Beatles, what do they always say? That the Beatles were a cultural phenomenon. They changed culture. This is not something that I'm guessing at or speculating. This has been written many, many, many times over. And going back to when the Beatles first hit the world stage, they were talking about how they're changing culture.
People back then don't know how revolutionary it was for them to show up with messy hair or mop heads, right?
But that's right.
So it was incremental. It was almost like they just boiled the frog, so to speak, culturally, where they went from mop hair to LSD, heavy drug use, and psychedelic music, so it's really something. It was very
incremental, William, the way Tavistock and the Handlers pushed the Beatles forward. It started off very basic. So, their first single, Love Me Do, and P.S. I Love You, and then going to their first album, Please Please Me, which was released on March 22nd, which is the 322 Skull and Bones number. Okay. Also, it's Genesis 322, so take a look at Genesis 322. Then going to their second album, the UK release. The UK releases were their official releases, not the Capitol releases in the US. It was the UK releases on the Parlophone label. They were their official albums. Their second album was released in the UK on November 22nd, 1963. It was the same day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Now, interestingly enough, in the book it tells us that the British control system knew that Kennedy was going to be assassinated, and so they didn't release the album in the US on November 22nd of 1963. That wound up being Meet the Beatles. The UK version was With the Beatles. They released the album. They waited until January of 1964 to release the album. Did they do it out of respect for what took place on March 22nd of 1963 here in the United States? No. They knew what was going to happen. They did it because they didn't want record sales to be damaged or be overshadowed by the assassination of John Kennedy. So the Beatles, they start, William, in Hamburg in mid-August of 1960. Now, when they show up in Hamburg in August of 1960, they are a very mediocre band, very limited musical talent. Again, this is not something that is my opinion.
This is well established. Yeah,
this is well established. And actually, Billy, who plays the part of Paul McCartney, has talked about this a number of times in various interviews over the years, that when they were not very good when they were in Hamburg. So at that point, John was 20 years old, Paul was 18, and George was 17 years old. And Pete Best, I don't know how old Pete was at the time, but Pete was in the band at that point in time. So the Beatles actually, they do their stints in Hamburg in 1960, starting in August, and then they head home back to Liverpool in December of 1960, completely dejected. This is detailed out in a book titled, and it's also detailed in other books, but the book I'm going to mention is by Joseph Niezgoda, Lennon Prophecy, which was published back in 2008. So the Beatles were an abject failure in 1960 when they were in Hamburg. There was no wins there. They didn't accomplish anything. Starting in 1961, they start getting all of these gigs. And if you go onto Wikipedia and you take a look at the Beatles' live performances, just type that into Wikipedia, you're going to see page after page after page. Every month, day after day, they're doing these gigs. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, well, how is this band, which is not very good, and they didn't show any songwriting acumen. This was explained to us in a number of George Martin interviews, and I have these interviews, but George Martin is quite frank about their lack of musical skill and their lack of songwriting prowess. But in any case, so in 1961, they're playing all these gigs and they're just cranking along. And then in November 9th of 1961, that's when Brian Epstein, who became their manager. Alan Williams was their manager back in the Hamburg days. That's when Brian Epstein meets them at the Cavern Club, and the story goes he loved them and he wanted to sign them, he wanted to manage them and all that stuff. So let's just recap a little bit. August 1960 through December of 1960, zero, nothing. January of 1961 through when they meet Brian Epstein at the Cavern Club, still really nothing. They're doing a lot of gigs, but they're playing cover music. They were a bar and club band. That's what the Beatles were. They weren't playing original music. Fast forward from the time they met Brian Epstein in November of 1961 to January 1st of 1962. That's when they had their Decca audition. So now another question is, how does this band, this nondescript band that really nobody knows anything about, other than the fact that they're playing these bars and clubs and with stints over in Hamburg, how did they manage to get time with Decca to do a demo? 15 songs. That's what we're told they did on January 1st of 1962. So they had 12 cover songs and then 3, quote, originals. So those originals were Like Dreamers Do, Hello Little Girl, and Love of the Love. Now, none of those original songs that they allegedly wrote ever made their way onto any of the Beatles' albums when they were together as a band. Those songs made their way onto the anthology album. I think at least 2 of them did. But those 3 that were played on January 1st of 1962 for Decca, not on any of their albums that were released when they were together. Decca turns the Beatles down. Nope, we're not interested. Then Brian Epstein takes the tapes over to George Martin, and I believe that was in February of 1962. George Martin says to Brian Epstein, I'm not going to sign him either. Based upon what you're showing me, I'm not interested. Then something happens. The Beatles wind up signing a contract with EMI in June of 1962. So the question becomes, what the heck happened between February of 1962 when George Martin turned him down and June of 1962 when he signs a contract to bring them on board to the EMI Parlophone label? That's a good question. In the book, it says that George Martin had received a phone call from a higher up and said to George, you're going to take them on. You're going to sign them. Now, who that phone call came from, I don't know. At the time, George Martin was working for a guy by the name of Len Wood. And Len Wood reported up to the chairman of EMI at the time, which was Sir Joseph Lockwood. So that phone call either came from Len Wood or Joseph Lockwood. And if it came from Len Wood got it from Joseph Lockwood. That would be my guess. So it's quite possible at the time when George Martin turned him down that he was not yet brought into the loop as to what the plan was for the Beatles. So he turned him down. They weren't a good band, and he wasn't going to spend any time with them. But then he got the phone call. So what happened between February and when George Martin said, I'm not going to sign him, and then in June when he did sign them, is the Beatles started performing for the BBC in March of 1962. So here's another question. How did this band, this bar and club band that was playing cover tunes, how did they land a gig with the BBC in March of 62? And that ran through 1965. So the BBC sessions ran through 1965. So let's just think about this for a moment. Turned down by Decca, turned down by George Martin, and then BBC says, yeah, come on to the BBC and we'll do the live at the BBC shows. And then 3 months later, they're signed by EMI. Now, when George Martin had the Beatles, he said that they had nothing behind them, that the best song he could find from them at the time was Love Me Do, and which he knew was not the big hit that they were looking for. And none of them stood out. Those are George Martin's words. And in another interview, he had said that it was not apparent at the time that they were songwriters, and goes on to say that their songs were awful. There was also an interview done by their engineer at the time, Norman Smith. Norman Smith was their engineer working with George Martin from their first album, Please Please Me, in 1963 through Rubber Soul. And then Jeff Emmerich took the reins as the engineer, starting with Revolver. In a magazine article from New Music Express, Norman Smith explains that they failed in the studio, that they had a lot of difficulty getting Love Me Do down, and he was not impressed with them at all. So there's a lot of these types of stories that are there from people like George Martin, from Norman Smith. So I decided, instead of ignoring them, I thought, why are they saying this? These are interesting things to say when the official narrative tells us the Beatles were brilliant. Okay, so, and when people do hear this, they'll say, well, that's because George Martin nurtured them and he brought them along. You're going to see, as I take you through this, that that's not the case at all. There's a Beatles documentary that goes back to the 1980s. It's titled The Complete Beatles. It was considered the Beatles documentary at the time until Anthology was released in the 1990s. And in that documentary, it tells us that Paul McCartney and John Lennon, either individually or together, wrote 100 songs between 1956 and 1962. They wrote 100 songs. That's what it tells us in the documentary. If that's the case, then how come there were only 3 songs for the Decca audition? And why did George Martin say that the only song that he can get out of them was Love Me Do, if they even wrote that song? Right. Where did the 100 songs go? And so what happens is, what we find, William, is that narrative of 100 songs completely dissipates as we move through time. We really never hear about the 100 songs anymore. It's in the documentary, and then it just kind of falls off the cliff, and then we start with a new narrative, which is the Beatles start writing these songs, not pulling from a backlog they had. So they signed in June of 1962, and then 9 months later, they released their first album, UK release, Please Please Me. And on that album, there were 14 tracks, 8 of which were original compositions and 6 cover songs. So a band that in June of 1962 didn't have anything behind them, according to George Martin, now all of a sudden was able to crank out 8 original songs for the first album, Please Please Me. Now, the other thing I should mention when I go back to George Martin, when he took them on board, he didn't work with them one-on-one initially. He delegated that to Ron Richards, who was another producer, I guess an assistant producer to George Martin. And Ron worked with the band at first. And Ron took them into the studio to record and to see what he can get out of them. And what he got out of them was nothing. Because what happened was, when George Martin came back, and I think probably Brian Epstein was there, they did the playback, it wasn't good. Let's put it this way. When we're talking about big labels, and we're talking about putting out music, I mean, it's got to be top shelf. And it was not top shelf. In Memoirs, it tells us George Martin received another phone call. No more delegation. You've got to work with this band directly. Of course, George Martin was a very accomplished composer, musician. What a lot of people don't realize is that George Martin, not only was he the Beatles producer, but he was the head of the Parlophone label, which was part of EMI. He was given the Parlophone label to run when he was 29 years old. It would seem to me that they had big things in store for George. So now George Martin is working with the Beatles directly. So where did the 8 songs come from? Their second release came out, as I mentioned before, in November 22nd of 1963. That's 8 months after their first album, Please Please Me, was released. And there's another 8 original songs and 6 covers. So who's turning out these songs? This is a band that didn't have any songs. And now all of a sudden, they're cranking these tunes out. We get into 1964, and they released the Hard Day's Night album in conjunction with the movie. The album has 13 tracks. We're told that all 13 tracks were original compositions by the Beatles. Their fourth album is Beatles for Sale, 8 more originals, 6 covers. In 1965, in the beginning of the year, they released the Help album, 12 original songs. Out of the 14, there were 2 covers on the Help album, along with 12 original tracks. And I'll get to Rubber Soul in a moment, and I'll explain how it is that, to me, is proof that the Beatles did not write all their own music, or did they play on all of their recorded tracks. And the other thing we have to really put into context here is, starting in 1963, going through 64, 1965, and it lightened up a bit on the second half of 65 going into 66. But when we talk about 63 1964 and 65. 64 and 65, we're talking about the height of Beatlemania. The Beatles are doing world tours. They're doing press conferences. They did 2 movies. In 64, they did A Hard Day's Night. In 65, they did Help. And by the way, the filming of A Hard Day's Night was sandwiched in between the recording dates of the recording of the album A Hard Day's Night. So not only are we told that they were in the studio writing and recording music for the album, but they were also on the film set filming the movie, and it's the same exact thing that took place in 1965 with Help. The filming for the movie Help was sandwiched in between the recording periods, the beginning and end dates for the recording for the Help album. So the question becomes, where are they finding this time to write music? Now, when we get to Rubber Soul, it gets to be very interesting. So the story behind Rubber Soul is that the Beatles had come off their U.S. tour. They ended the tour, concluded on August 31st of 1965. Then there was a 6-week period. They were on holiday, vacation. In Mark Lewison's book, it tells us that it was free time. There was no work, which means they were not writing music. A lot of people like to say, well, that's when they were writing the music. The official narrative does not tell us they were writing music during that 6-week period of time from when the tour ended to when they entered EMI Studios on October 11th of 1965. They were not writing music. So they get into EMI on October 11th of 65. The October 11th date is Scott Fryman, who does the Deconstructing the Beatles DVDs presentations. That's the umbrella title, Deconstructing the Beatles. And then underneath that, what he does is he deconstructs each one of their albums. So they show up October 11th. October 12th is when they start recording, and they have to wrap up by November 11th. And they actually wrapped up into the early morning hours of November 12th. So for the sake of putting this together simplistically, let's just say October 11th through November 11th, a 30-day period of time, the Beatles came into the Rubber Soul sessions with essentially no backlog of music. They had no songs. Now, if we look at the official narrative, they'll tell us, well, they had a little bit of Michelle. They had a little bit of We Can Work It Out. Maybe a little bit of another song. So essentially, they were on the hook for 14 original songs for the album and 2 more songs for a double A-side single, which was Day Tripper and We Can Work It Out. So the Beatles had to write, learn, and when I say learn, if John wrote a song or Paul wrote a song, they then had to bring it to the band, and the rest of the band had to learn the song. They had to write, learn, rehearse, and whenever you rehearse a song, there is give and take. There are going to be changes. You're going to have input from the rest of the band members, and you're going to have to work through the song. Then the songs have got to be arranged, and then when you're ready, you're going to record. They're going to push the record button, and the songs get recorded. After the songs get recorded, they get mixed down. So some people want to argue with me and say, well, they didn't have to write 16 songs. They had some songs. In Mark Lewison's book, he says that they had to write more than a dozen songs. And what I explain to folks is whether we're talking about 12 songs, 14 songs, or 16 songs, when we're talking about writing 10, 12, 14, or 16 songs from scratch, that is an impossible task.
It's not that uncommon, by the way. Like, a lot of these bands won't disclose it, but their producers are the ones performing. I know
Yes.
stories. Some songs that people hear on the radio, I know the bands didn't play them in the studio. Like, I just know. Like, I know people in the industry that the band will come in, they'll bungle everything, and the guy will go, okay, I'll just play it. And they'll get credit for it.
That happens. I know people in the business too
frequently,
that have explained the exact same thing.
Yeah.
The guitar track will be laid down by the person in the band. They play it back. Like, that does not work.
The drummer's hung over or something. It's like, we got to get this done. I'll do it.
It's either the producer does it themselves, or they bring in a ringer. They bring in a studio guy, and they say, here, this is what we need you to fix. So let's delete that track. And
just don't talk about it.
They don't talk about it. Right. Now, here's the thing that we have to understand. So with the Beatles' schedule, a very hectic schedule, all of their concerts worldwide, we're talking about Japan, we're talking about Australia, we're talking about the U.S., they're everywhere. press conferences, 2 movies. They still found time, we're told, to write the music for the first 5 albums before we get to Rubber Soul. Then something really weird happened after the Help album in the early part of 1965. Apparently, everybody fell asleep at the switch. Everybody nodded off because the Beatles were on the hook. They were on the hook for 2 albums a year. So you had 2 albums in 63, 2 albums in 64. They were on the hook for 2 albums in 1965. The first one was Help. The second one would be Rubber Soul. And they were on the hook for 2 albums in 1966, which was Revolver. And because Paul McCartney was no longer with them, they wound up putting out a greatest hits album as the Christmas album in 1966 titled A Collection of Oldies. And we could talk about that maybe a little bit as to why a greatest hits album called A Collection of Oldies. Why are they oldies? The oldest song on the record is from 1963. It's only 3 years prior. So the question becomes, why were the Beatles, why did they have no music? Why did they come into the Rubber Soul sessions with essentially nothing? Are we to believe that Brian Epstein wasn't calling up Paul McCartney, John Lennon, and saying, hey guys, we've got studio time booked in October, and looks like we're going to need 16 songs. How are you guys coming along? Apparently that conversation never happened. And also, you would think that George Martin would also be asking that question and making a phone call to either Brian Epstein or the band members themselves, primarily John Lennon and Paul McCartney. How are we coming along, lads, with the music? Because the album's got to have 14 tracks, and we're also going to release a single with 2 additional songs. So 16 songs. Let me know how it's coming along. Apparently, that conversation, that dialogue, never took place. So they come into the studio and going to write from scratch now. Now, let me just explain a couple of things here. There were 2 interviews in 1966, about a year later, where Paul McCartney really let the cat out of the bag. He dropped some bombshells. The first interview was in June of 1966 at the Hilton in Japan. He was asked a question by the press about their songwriting and their musicianship, and Paul said that we never said we were very good musicians. We're adequate. And then there was an interview with the BBC on August 5th of 1966. That's the same day that Revolver, their 7th album, that's the album after Rubber Soul, was released. And in that interview, Paul said that we're limited as a group. We're the first to say we're not all that good musically. And also in that interview, when he was talking about, I'm assuming he's talking about the Revolver album because the interview took place when Revolver, on the day Revolver was released, he said that with the last LP, meaning Revolver, we took weeks to try to get just 1 song written. Now, if it took weeks to get 1 song written, how in God's name are you going to get 16 songs written in 30 days? Because 30 days is weeks. It's 4 weeks. It's plural. Also, in that interview, Paul dropped another bombshell. The official narrative tells us that the Beatles were prolific songwriters and they were writing all the time. It didn't matter. If they were on the road, they were writing music. If they were on a bus, they were writing music. If they were in a restaurant, they were writing music. When they were on film sets, they were writing music. They were writing music all the time. They were writing music when they had holiday. They were a perpetual songwriting machine. That's the official narrative. Most people will recognize, at least to some level, that's what we're told about the Beatles. In that August 5th, 1966 interview with the BBC, Paul McCartney told the BBC interviewer that they did not write music in between albums. Maybe 1 or 2. And because he used the word maybe could also mean 0. He said, we wrote in great big batches whenever we had to do a record or a film. But really, it's when they had to do a record because the songs that they recorded for the album were the songs that made their way into the film. The BBC interviewer responds by saying, I always thought it was quite impossible to write that number of songs, 12 songs, in such a short period of time. And I'm paraphrasing, but I have the interview. You could take a listen. And John says, it is sometimes quite impossible. going back, William, to what I was saying before, we get these pieces of information, this dialogue, these interviews that are out there that are showing cracks in the dam as far as the official narrative goes. I mean, they contradict the official narrative. So if we go take a look at Rubber Soul, let me just take you through really quickly here. It was like a conveyor belt. And let me just explain to everybody. And for those of you who are musicians and songwriters and you have recorded, or if you're in the music business, you're a sound engineer or a producer, and you're honest with yourself and you can shake off this Beatles conditioning, I think you'll see that this is not possible. Songwriting is a process. It's not something that you just crank out like it's a manufacturing line and you're producing widgets. It just does not work that way. So we're told the Beatles arrived at the EMI studios on October 11th of 1965. The very next day, October 12th, they complete Run for Your Life. On October 13th, the second day in, they nail Drive My Car. On October 16th, 5 days in, Day Tripper is in the bag. On the 18th of October, 7 days in, If I Needed Someone is knocked out. On October 21st, 10 days in, Norwegian Wood is completed. On October 22nd, 2 songs are done, In My Life and Nowhere Man. On October 29th, 18 days in, We Can Work It Out is completed. And then we get into November, and it's the same thing. Michelle, November 4th, What Goes On. November 8th, Think for Yourself. November 10th, The Word is completed. On November 11th, the very last day of recording, they finish up 4 songs in one long session on November 11th. 2 of those songs, You Won't See Me and Girl, didn't exist before November 11th. So they had to be written from scratch, learned, rehearsed, arranged on that day, and then recorded. Wait, we're told, was brought in from the help sessions. Okay, but they still had to do some overdubs and the vocals on that. So they didn't have to technically write that song, but there still had to be work done to the song to complete it for the album. And then the other song, the 4th song, was I'm Looking Through You. We're also told that it took no more than 5 takes to nail down the basic rhythm tracks for any of those songs. So the basic rhythm tracks would be your guitar, your bass, your drums. It's the basic rhythm tracks for the songs. However, when we fast forward 3 years to the White Album, it's 3 years later. When you take a look at how many takes it took for many of the White Album songs, we're talking about dozens. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 takes to get the songs nailed down. Yet, we're to believe that 3 years earlier, coming into EMI Studios with a blank piece of paper, they wrote 16 songs, or pick your number, 10, 12, 14, or 16 songs in 30 days, and each of the basic rhythm tracks took no more than 5 takes.
It's crazy. It's hard to believe that. Those sold like millions and millions of copies worldwide, too. Multi-platinum sellers.
Well, and here's the other thing, William. There were 6 days in that 30-day period of time where there was no recording scheduled because the Beatles had one day was slotted out for some fan club obligations. I think it was a flexi disc they had to create. There were 2 days that were mixing. George Martin and Norman Smith were mixing down the songs. There was 1 day taken out. That's when they received their MBEs from the Queen. There was 2 days where they had to step out to do a TV special.
Right, so they're anointed too. So all these guys are getting anointed by the royalty, Martin and all these.
Yeah, they got their MBEs during right smack in the middle of when they were allegedly sitting down writing and recording for.
So who's the brains behind it? Martin's connected, or somebody at EMI is connected to somebody at Tavistock. It's all secret, but they're perfect fronts in a lot of ways. Like
George Martin was instrumental in this. There's no question in my mind. Some people believe that Theodore Adorno from the Frankfurt School, and again, the Frankfurt School and Tavistock were connected at the hip, wrote all of their music. And in my big presentation, going back to April of 2020, I had to disagree with that. Actually, Coleman says that.
Coleman says that, yeah.
That Adorno wrote all the music, but there are other researchers that subscribe to that. I don't.
Where's the proof? Where's the proof that Adorno? He was like a hardcore intellectual. Where's his artistic skills and musical skills?
He was also a musician. Theodore Adorno, he was a composer. He spent a lot of time with what is referred to as atonal music. This is music that doesn't have a root. The best way for me to explain atonal music to somebody is if you listen to the old horror movies and you hear the piano in the background and it's just basically, it's scattered, it's all over the place. It doesn't seem to have a root or a center. That's atonal music. But there was a reason why Adorno was playing with atonal music, because he believed that from chaos you create order. So you had to force the chaos in order to have the order emerge. But that's a discussion for another day. Adorno was well equipped to compose and to write music. Now, do I believe that he was sitting down writing every Beatles song? No. What I think happened is that Adorno was overseeing the project, and that doesn't mean that he did not contribute songs. He was overseeing it from a social engineering, social scientist perspective. And he was working with George Martin directly. And between the two of them, because I believe George Martin was also writing songs for the Beatles, one of them being Michelle. I have an interview where George Martin says the guitar part, the lead part in Michelle, he says, is my composition. So he's taking credit for at least part of the song for Michelle, but I believe it's very possible that he wrote the entire song. I think what happened was the way they had it set up was you had Adorno and you had Martin. Think of George Martin as the managing director, and underneath them were maybe a half a dozen crack songwriters that were dedicated to the Beatles project. Now, back when I did my April presentation, April of 2020, did the Beatles write all their own music? I was working with somebody he's very accomplished and very astute in the music industry and as well as a musician. He went back and he was listening to the Beatles' early music, 62 to 66. He deducted that he thought that there were two styles in play. In other words, there was maybe 2 to 3 songwriters that were dedicated to John Lennon-style songs, and another 2 to 3 songwriters that were dedicated to writing Paul McCartney-style songs. I think that that's likely how it worked. I really don't believe one person wrote all the songs. You have to have a pipeline of stuff coming in so that you can assess it and decide which songs are the songs that you're going to go with.
Right, makes sense, yeah.
So what happened with Rubber Soul, there's 2 problems with Rubber Soul. The first problem is writing 12, 14, 16 songs in 30 days. It's just not possible.
No, it's not. Not of that caliber, not of that fame and caliber.
That's the thing, and that's what I explain to people. If you want to argue that you can write 14, 15, 16 songs, okay, but what are you looking for? Are you looking for an album with 1 decent song and 13 filler tracks? That's not what the Beatles turned out with Rubber Soul. Rubber Soul is considered a pivotal record not only for the Beatles, but for rock and roll itself, along with Revolver. These were turnkey albums as far as pop music goes. It wasn't an album full of junk.
Right. Tomorrow Never Knows, this weird stuff. Where did they get all this influence from these other musical instruments? It's a mystery. Like, these are young kids. They didn't go to music school or go to...
No, they have no formal music training. They have no formal training in music theory. And this is admitted, by the way. This is admitted in the official narrative that the Beatles could not read or write music.
Yeah, it just doesn't make any sense. This is just a massive culture creation. And it's not just the music. It's the packaging, it's the ideas, it's the lyrics. It's the whole
thing. You got it. It's the packaging and the presentation.
Yeah.
So now here's the thing, William. I know I don't want to run you over here on time, but...
Yeah, unfortunately, I got another one in an hour and a half, so I do...
Okay, I'll get to this real quick.
Okay.
That's the first issue with Rubber Soul. The second issue is that the manufacturing cycle time does not work. So here's the thing. The Beatles finish up recording the early morning hours of November 12th of 1965 after the 30 days. George Martin completes the sequencing of the songs. The sequencing of the songs is the order that the songs will play on the record. Side A, side B. Sequencing is very important because it establishes the flow of the album, but it's also important because with 33 RPM records, if you don't calculate the tracks properly, place the songs strategically from a time perspective, and leave enough dead wax that's around the center label of the record, albums or records could experience what they call groove distortion. Because what happens is the closer that the stylus of a turntable moves toward the center of the record, toward the spindle, there's a higher likelihood of groove distortion. So I'm letting people know this because it's not just a matter of just slapping a list together and saying this is the sequencing. This is looked at very carefully to make sure that they minimize that occurrence. And quite honestly, depending upon the quality of your stylus on your turntable and all that stuff will make a big, big difference. But I'm just saying there's a science behind it. So George Martin finishes the sequencing on November 16th of 1965. The very next day, we're told that on the 17th of November of 65, the final mono lacquer is created. Now, the vinyl lacquer is what is used to start the pressing process of the vinyl. The Beatles had to get, or EMI had to get the record in stores by December 3rd of 1965. So from November 17th of 1965, that's really when the manufacturing process begins, when the lacquer is finalized, because that's when the pressing process can begin, to December 3rd of 1965, we're talking a little over 2 weeks. So the question becomes, how did they get all those records to stores by December 3rd in a little over 2 weeks when the sequencing of the songs wasn't known until November 16th? Why is that a problem, Mike? Because the sequencing of the songs is listed on the center label of the record. The songs are also listed on the back cover of the album jacket. How did thousands of labels and thousands of album jackets get printed and delivered in a day? The answer to the question is, it can't be done. Because back in the day, they used 4-color printing. And 4-color printing, they had these rolls of 4 different colors. I was told by a person I work with who is still in the business and has been in the business for a long time and is very, very well-versed in the vinyl process and the album covers and all that stuff and the printing. It took a week for the ink to dry, 1 week alone, for the ink to dry on the album covers before they can handle them and do something with them, ship them, and then send them over to the plant so that the records can be inserted. And I was also told that the typical process took 8 to 10 weeks. From the time that the lacquer was finalized, it took, let's just say, 2 months before you can get that record out. If the lacquer was cut on November 17th, we're into January. So the question becomes, how was this done? Because the records did get to the stores. Here's how it was done. This is what I concluded. All of the songs were pre-written by ghostwriters. And those songs were recorded by George Martin while the Beatles were out doing their tours, doing their press conferences, and being on film sets and doing all that stuff. George Martin was behind the scenes with the music already written, bringing in the studio players and recording the instrumental tracks. They were done. And because the songs were written, the song titles were already known. And because the songs were already recorded, the instrumental tracks, they knew the run times of the songs. So they knew the song would be 2.5 minutes, 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes. That allowed for the sequencing work to get done. So the sequencing wasn't done on November 16th of 1965. It was done weeks before that. So songs were written, the instrumental tracks to the songs were recorded, the sequencing was known, song titles were known, printing process begins. Now you can submit the requirements to have the center labels printed and the album jackets printed and have them on standby for when the Beatles finish the vocals. So what the Beatles did for 30 days at EMI between October 11th and November 11th of 1965 was record the vocal tracks. They were singing to the instrumental tracks that were already pre-recorded. So their job was to nail the vocals in 30 days. So when Paul McCartney was saying that we had to write songs, we wrote songs in great big batches, I think what he was telling us is we had to learn the vocals to those songs in great big batches. And when the songs came in, the instrumentals came in, I don't think there's any question there needed to be guide vocals so that they can learn the songs and then they would put their vocals onto the recording. And so then what George Martin was able to do once the Beatles completed the vocals, because remember now, folks, the instrumental tracks are done. Now, once he had the vocals done, all he needed to do was to mix the vocals with the instrumental tracks. And now he's got the complete song. The other thing that we need to understand is that the center labels on a 33 RPM record are pressed at the exact same time that the record is pressed. Because some people wanted to argue with me and say, well, maybe the labels were added later. No, that's not the process. And I have these videos, by the way, in my presentations. I show you the pressing process. The labels go on at the same time the vinyl is pressed. And then, once the vinyl is pressed, it goes off and it's inserted into the sleeves. Then they start to package the albums and stage them for distribution. And then they get them out to the retail outlets. And remember, back in the day, there was no internet, there were no online stores, there were no box stores. Everything was small mom and pop retail outlets that they had to get those songs out to. So there was a lot of trucking going out of the EMI plant.
Tons of distribution, yeah.
Yeah, to get those records out. So what Rubber Soul, the way it worked is, and I believe, I'm going to say I know, that was the process for all of the Beatle records.
Right.
Between 1962, I'll say 62, going into 63, because that's when Please Please Me was released, right through Revolver. Here's another thing that a lot of people probably don't know. After Revolver, that's the album after Rubber Soul, the Beatles went on tour. When they went on tour, they did not play one song from their newly released Revolver album. Not one song, not one track that was on the Revolver album was played live at the concert. Now, why do you think that is? The answer is because they didn't know the songs. They were not taught. They did not learn how to play the songs. So what happened was when the Beatles were taught to play songs to take out on the road. So they would have sessions where they would learn and rehearse these songs, and that's what they would take out on the road. I did a little analysis, and I mean, it's not scientific in any way, but I was taking a look at all of their set lists and trying to figure out, okay, how many songs out of all of the songs that were available to them at the time did they play in concert? They played maybe 25% of the songs, 25 to 30% of the songs that were released by them, original compositions I'm talking about.
Right.
And the other thing is with their concerts, they were 30 minutes. In most cases, the set list consisted of 11 songs, typically 9, quote, original compositions and 2 covers.
Not very long songs either. You know, these are not like 5
2.5,
minutes,
3 minute songs.
Yeah, 2.5.
That's what I got into. And, of course, you know, when I released my presentation in April of 2020, it caused a big ruckus.
Dispelling an illusion that these guys are some of the greatest artists of all time.
Well, I will say this to make Beatle fans feel a little better. John Lennon and George Harrison wrote more of their own material going forward from 67 into 1970, the Billy period, and they played on more of the recorded tracks. But the Beatles were still using ghostwriters and session players even during that period in order to fill out the music.
Wow, incredible.
I have a clip of Glenn Campbell. Glenn was with the Wrecking Crew, a guitar virtuoso. He was guest hosting on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour going back to July of 1968, and he was introducing the band Cream, Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce, and Ginger Baker. And when he introduced them, he was explaining that they were top shelf session players. They were the cream of the crop. And he said that they played on Beatle records, Stones records. So Glenn let the cat out of the bag. Another person that has been talking about playing on Beatle records since the late 1970s is the legendary drummer, studio drummer, who drummed for Aretha Franklin for 25 years, Bernard Purdie. So Bernard came out and said that he drummed on 21 Beatle tracks from the early albums. And Bernard has never pulled back from that statement.
Wow.
He also said
these are just the ones who kind of came out. This is just the ones who've disclosed.
Ones that came out. And I was contacted by a person that I had been communicating with for a while before I released my big presentation back in April of 2020. They wrote me an email and they said, well, Mike, now the cat is out of the bag. Let me just tell you that Ronnie Verrill, the great session player, drummer out of the UK, also drummed on Beatle records. Another Paul is Dead researcher did some work for a professional drummer, studio drummer out of the UK, and they had a discussion. He told my friend, my acquaintance, that another Beatle drummer was Alan White, who played for Yes. And
Interesting.
also for the Plastic Ono band, he did some drumming for Lennon. And of course, the official narrative tells us that George Martin hired Andy White, no relation, Andy White, to drum on P.S. I Love You and Love Me Do. But I've always said that I don't think George Martin hired Andy White, who is also a great session drummer, to just play on 2 songs.
I wish we could probably talk for 10 hours. Here's the good news for the listeners. They can go to your website or your YouTube channel and go through all the other stuff you've seen, the presentation on Rubber Soul. You've done a lot of interviews with other hosts I recognize, so you can check that out. So I'll put links to your YouTube channel and your website. But thanks so much for your time. It's just an incredible amount of knowledge.
Are we going to do a little bit of a roundup of some of your stuff? You've spent many years on this topic. How much more is there to know? Because you painted the clear picture, and there's other people out there with different ideas, but I think your research stands out as being the go-to one with regard to especially your Rubber Soul work, which proves really that there's no way they could have come up with those songs for that album in that 30 days, whatever it was.
I did it for 8 years, and I covered all the ground that I believed that I needed to cover, and it came full circle. I was telling Billy the other day, periodically what I do to update my website is to count up the number of views on my Beatles content. And previously, I only used to count the views on my 2 YouTube channels. So there's The Sage of Quay, which is my main channel, and then there's my Beatles channel, Mike Williams' Paul is Dead. And I would count the views up between those 2 channels. The views were 5 million between my 2 YouTube channels, with my Paul is Dead channel making up 3.6 million of the 5.
Assuming these views are correct as well, because we know numbers get hidden.
YouTube suppresses my views. I've known that for a long time. I've caught them a number of times pulling views out, but it just is what it is. So I'm just going to go with whatever numbers are there. But you're right. I mean, they do suppress. But what has really worked for me over the last year and a half or so is Rumble. There is no suppression of the views. What I noticed is when I put my Beatle content up on Rumble, it takes off. So I'm getting 10, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 views per video. Whereas if I go back to YouTube, it'll say 5 to 10, maybe 12,000 views. Well, that same interview or that same presentation did 30 or 40,000 views on Rumble. The reason why I'm telling you this is because I added my Rumble views as well. So the new number, the number of total views and listens to my content since inception, since September of 2016 through November of 2024, last month, 6.5 million.
Have you not done BitChute and Odyssey as well?
I do BitChute and Odyssey, but the numbers there, they're decent numbers there. But I can't count everything because I have to actually do it manually. So I take the big hitter platforms and I'll add those numbers up. Plus, it gives me buffer, Billy, because there's always going to be some nitwit that's going to say, I don't believe that your number is really 6.5 million. And like, well, I'm just counting 3 platforms. If you want to tack on Odyssey, BitChute, and Brighteon, you can go knock yourself out and make the number bigger if you'd like. People ask me all the time, you think more and more people are getting it? And my answer is yes, more and more people are getting it. More and more people who are critically thinking, awake, they get it. There are still, well, obviously there are people out there that believe that the Beatles were what the narrative tells them, this great, fantastic, magical band with all of this chemistry, 2 greatest songwriters of all time for pop music. So you have that segment, which is huge. And then you've got, within the Paul is Dead community, you have these other researchers that they like to focus on Paul being replaced. Not that that's not important, because Paul was replaced back in 1966, but they don't want to go back in time and they don't want to take a look at the true creation story of the Beatles. They don't want to talk about that because they want to believe the Cinderella story. They want to believe that the Beatles were this organic, natural group, these four guys from Liverpool, connected in with Brian Epstein, and then Brian got them a contract with EMI under the tutelage of George Martin, and then they went on to unparalleled fame and fortune. They want to believe that that entire process is organic and real. If you think that way, then you really don't understand, as Jordan Maxwell used to say, how the world really works. And we just went through those charts and showed the corporate span of control and the pyramid of power. To think that the Beatles did what they did organically, at least up to a certain point, because some of them will say, oh, well, the deep state got involved when Billy got involved. Before that, the deep state was sound asleep at the switch. They allowed this band to climb to tremendous heights, and then they decided to do something with them.
They just got an Ed Sullivan show to an audience of all of America.
Exactly. They just happened to wind up on the Ed Sullivan show and have all of the media attention that they got, which was really unparalleled at the time. That was a natural occurrence. It's not a natural occurrence, but the thing is, the researchers that continue to focus on that, and they want to say that Mike's wrong. The Beatles wrote their music. Justice for Paul McCartney. He was a brilliant songwriter. John was a brilliant songwriter. George would chime in once in a while. They want to believe that stuff. Look, it's a fairy tale, or plain and simple. Believing that story is no different than me telling you that a 300-pound guy in a red suit and a white beard can slip down a chimney with a bag of Christmas gifts. It's the same thing. It's not how the world works. And to continue to believe that and then say, well, you're a Beatles researcher, you're missing a big piece of what it is that you should be looking at. I mean, you're only playing half the football field. So in the United States, for those who don't know, American football is 100 yards. Many of them started at the 50-yard line and went right, but they didn't take a look at the 50-yard line going back left to the very beginning. You know, in fact, Billy, if you want to throw up one of the slides, it's the one. It's a 1960 to 1963 timeline.
Is it that one?
That's it. So to try to drive the point home, based upon what I was just talking about, here's the Beatles timeline from 1960 through 1963. So the Beatles go to Hamburg in August of 1960, and they're not very good at all. And it's not just me saying this. This is well documented. The Beatles themselves have talked about this. When they got to Hamburg, they were not very good musicians, marginal at best, and they showed no songwriting skills, none. And so in August of 1960, John is 20, Paul is 18, George is 17, and at that time, Pete Best is their drummer. So they are young, inexperienced, and they are rough around the edges. They are a bar and club band. And in fact, in the Beatles documentary, The Complete Beatles, their manager, Alan Williams, who was their manager at the time, tells a story where he was trying to get them into clubs in Hamburg, and he was told, don't bring that bum group, the Beatles, to Hamburg. They spent August through December of 1961 in Hamburg, and it's a flop. It's a failure. In Joseph Niesgoda's book, Lennon Prophecy, he explains that both Paul and John come back home dejected because absolutely nothing materialized. But then something very interesting takes place. Starting in 1961, they start to book all of these club dates, and they're performing just about every day. I mean, they have maybe a day off here or there, but it's very consistent. They keep going along, booking all of these performances, these live gigs in these bars and these clubs, both, locally within Liverpool and outside of Liverpool. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, who's doing all this booking? How is this happening? This is a band that just spent 4 months in Hamburg and fell on their face. They come back home and all of a sudden you're getting all of these gigs. So all of these gigs continue from 1961 up through when they arrive in America on February 7th of 1964.
Do you think that's when the Faustian deal was done?
The Faustian deal, according to memoirs, was done on October 24th of 1963 after the release of their first album, Please Please Me. So we've got the Beatles now, right? So they're coming off this big disaster in Hamburg, and now they're getting all these gigs booked starting in 1961 through 62, 63, and like I said, heading into when they landed in America, which was called the Beatles Conquering America. So we can talk about that a little bit too if I have time. But not only that, they have an audition with Decca on January 1st of 1962. So 1961, doing these live gigs. They're still not a very good band. They're a bar and club group. They land an audition with Decca, major label, and were told that they did 15 songs, 3 of which were original compositions, Like Dreamers Do, Hello Little Girl, and Loved of the Loved. None of these songs saw the light of day on any of their albums released while the band was together. So that tells you something about the quality of those songs. They wound up on the anthology series. I think at least 2 of them did. And Decca turns them down. Decca says, no, not interested. So then Brian Epstein takes tapes to George Martin in February of 1962. And George Martin, who was with EMI, and he's the head of the Parlophone label, George Martin actually was running Parlophone. He was running the Parlophone label. He was given the label to run at the age of 29. So they had big things slotted for George Martin. So Martin listens to the tapes, and he says, nope, if you want me to decide based upon what you're showing me, I'm not going to sign them. So now they're rejected by Decca. They're rejected by EMI Parlophone. At that point, right after George Martin says no, now the Beatles somehow wind up on the BBC. So in March of 1962, after flopping in Hamburg August through December of 1960, not getting the nod with the Decca audition, not getting the nod by George Martin, now they're playing their BBC gigs. And they play their BBC gigs from March of 1962 through May of 1965. How did that happen? How did that happen?
Yeah, I thought that was a very interesting one.
Yeah, you do not get on the BBC, a major media outlet, unless you've got a machine behind you. So then what happens is EMI and George Martin have a change of heart. That's because George Martin, according to memoirs, was told to take the Beatles on. So in June of 1962, that's when their contract with EMI is signed. And there's a lot of speculation as to why George Martin had that about face. And I won't get into, all the details here. I'll just tell you that my perspective is that at that time when George Martin turned him down in February of 62, he was not yet brought into the loop as to what the Beatles were going to be and what they were going to be used for. So what happened, though, was when George Martin signed them and brought them on, he didn't work with them right away. He assigned that to Ron Richards. Ron Richards was an assistant or associate producer working with George Martin, and Ron Richards actually went on to go produce the Hollies. And he worked with the band in the studio, and he couldn't get anything out of them. So when George Martin came, and I think it was Brian Epstein to listen to the playback, it was obvious that they weren't going anywhere because what they were listening to on the playback, what was recorded, was not very good. And that's when George Martin received another phone call. And he was told, no delegating. You've got to take this band under your wing, and you're going to be responsible for them. You're going to manage them. You're going to be their producer. So it was from that point on that George Martin was connected at the hip with the Beatles, and he played a very, very, very important role in making the Beatles what they became.
Now, he was known as the fifth Beatle.
Known as the fifth Beatle. So I have another chart there, Billy, if you can show the George Martin chart. So these are all things that George Martin said. I have all of the audio and interviews. I just mentioned that when Brian Epstein showed him the tapes back in February of 62, he said to Brian Epstein, if you want me to judge them based on what you are playing me, I'm sorry, I need to turn you down. And then he said, on meeting the Beatles in 1962, I wasn't terribly impressed with the first stuff they did. And then in the documentary produced by George Martin, he's talking to Howard Goodall, who's another composer and broadcaster and very accomplished. And he said, they had this wonderful charisma. They made you feel good. But I thought their music was rubbish. And then George Martin in another interview says that even though they had really nothing behind them, they were still fairly irreverent. And then he said, so I looked at these 4 guys and thought none of them shines above all the others. Now, this is an interesting thing to say, right? Because if John Lennon and Paul McCartney were these fantastic songwriters and writing songs all the time, in fact, in the Complete Beatles, it tells us that John Lennon and Paul McCartney, either individually or together, between 1956 and 1962, wrote 100 songs. They weren't recorded, but they wrote 100 songs. Yet, George Martin is saying they had nothing behind them. He said, Love Me Do was the best song I could find from them. I was very conscious. It wasn't the big hit I was looking for. In fact, when George Martin first had the Beatles, when he was told to take them on, one of the first things that he did was to go look for songs for them to record. And then in another interview, he said they certainly had no, and in this interview, when he says this, George pauses because now he has to measure his words very carefully.
He's going to say discernible talent.
He says it wasn't too obvious they could be songwriters at this stage. Love Me Do was the best thing they had. And then he went on to say their songs were awful.
But Ringo involved at this point.
Ringo came on board. If you go to the chart that has the Mercy Beat article. So this was an article that was published in the August-September 1962 edition of Mercy Beat. And the article talks about the Beatles changing their drummer, so Pete Best is out and Ringo is in. But in that article, it says, the Beatles will fly to London to make recordings at EMI Studios. They will be recording numbers that have been specifically written for the group, which they have received from their recording manager, George Martin. So the picture I'm painting, folks, the story here, is that the Beatles weren't these four genius, brilliant musicians, and Paul McCartney and John Lennon weren't these prolific genius songwriters. They were a creation of the Tavistock Institute that had linkages back to the Frankfurt School, Theodore Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Erich Fromm, that whole group. And as I mentioned to Billy previously, Tavistock created the Beatles, along with the Rolling Stones, and many other bands that came out of the British invasion, to take down traditional values, to tear it down, and to also attack and dismantle institutionalized religion, in particular in the United States, that would be Christianity. That is what the Beatles' mission was, and they were going to do it through music, and the creation of the Beatles was another cultural Marxist entity. Cultural Marxism is Marxism that subverts from within, versus what I refer to as Lenin Marxism, which is revolution-based and denoted by violence. The Bolshevik Revolution, as an example, would be an example of Lenin Marxism. But the Frankfurt School, which came into being at the same time as the Tavistock Institute in the 1920s, they had a different take, and they were Jewish Marxist intellectuals. Their approach was very different. They said, look, this whole thing where it's violent is not going to work. Because after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Marxists actually thought that they were going to be able to convert the rest of the world to Marxism. Workers unite. But the Frankfurt School had a different take on this. And by the way, the Rothschilds hail from Frankfurt, Germany. And there are many German Marxists that have come out of Germany, including Marx himself. So the Beatles were a creation of this Tavistock Frankfurt School ideology, social engineering initiative. The Beatles were the first band created for the sole purpose of social engineering at a worldwide level. So what we could do now, Billy, is if we can go to the Norman Smith article. So Norman Smith was their engineer from their first recordings. We'll go by their albums, Please Please Me Through, Rubber Soul, starting with Revolver. Their seventh studio album, it was Jeff Emerick. Norman Smith did an interview with New Musical Express in 1971. New Musical Express, the editor, was a guy by the name of Roy Carr. I'll talk about Roy in a bit as it pertains to Phil Spector. Very important. So Norman said that he was not impressed at all when the Beatles were recording in the studio. His musical doubts, meaning their musical ability, was backed up with Love Me Do. He said we had a hard time working on that one. And he said that they failed in the studio. This is their engineer. And then he goes on to say that the Beatles talked their way into a contract. So this is the fictional aspect of the story that we always get, right? So we get the truth if you read between the lines, and then what they do is they puff it up, they pump up the tires. You can't talk your way into a contract. EMI was the major label. I think it was the largest label in the world at the time. You either had it or you didn't. They were not going to waste their time with somebody giving you a bunch of words and trying to talk their way into the door. Not going to happen. He said the same thing that George Martin said. They had so much personality and so much magic about them. Right? George Martin said they had charisma. This is what it was all about. It was about shaping them to be charismatic, for them to have charm. They didn't care about the music because they weren't going to write the music. They weren't going to record the music. That was all going to be done by the Tavistock EMI deep state team. And in all likelihood, Theodore Adorno was overseeing that operation with George Martin being the managing director. of that operation. But we will get to Phil Spector in a moment. He said we did their first album, Please Please Me, in one take. Now, in the article, he says that they were awful. They failed in the studio. And then Norman Smith turns around and says that they completed the first album in one take. We did the whole album in a day. That's how we did it back then. Well, how they did it back then, when they did an album in one day, was to call the studio players in. And the studio musicians would bang out the songs. The sheet music would be put in front of them, and they would just cruise right through it. That's how it would get done in one day. It wasn't getting done by a band of four guys that the sound engineer was saying that they were awful and they failed in the studio and they couldn't get Love Me Do down. That group of people did not record their first album in one take. And the story goes that it was 10 songs recorded in a single day in February of 1963. 4 other songs were recorded earlier, and they were brought into the 14 tracks when they released their first debut album, Please Please Me, on March 22nd, which is the Skull and Bones number 322. It's also Genesis 322. For those of you who have your Bibles, read 322, and you'll understand what that also is representative of. So,
did not also say that Ringo couldn't do the drum part or something in that?
George Martin hired Andy White to play the drums, and George Martin hired more than, in my view, than just Andy White to do the drums. He just talked about Andy White. And in an interview that, in a discussion, I should say, that George Martin had with Billy, a.k.a. Paul McCartney, and I believe it's in the documentary produced by George Martin, George is telling the story of when the Beatles came into the studio. He said, well, who's that guy? And he goes, well, that's the drummer. He's talking about Ringo. And George Martin says, well, no, he's not the drummer. That's your drummer over there. I paid good money for that guy. He's talking about Andy White. But George Martin says something very, very important, and he didn't realize, I think, that he said it. Now, he's talking to Paul McCartney. When they came into the studio, well, if Billy is Paul McCartney, he would have been one of the guys that was in the studio. George Martin would have said, when you and the band came into the studio, he said, when they came into the studio. So that's another clue that Billy is not Paul McCartney. If you go back to the timeline chart, let me just finish up there because there's still some important stuff there that I wanted to take the audience through. So now the Beatles didn't have any songs. Okay, George Martin said the best thing they had was Love Me Do, and that's if they even wrote Love Me Do. So they have no songs, and that's as of June of 1962. And then, 9 months later, they come out with their first album, and that first album contains 8 original compositions, 6 covers and 8 originals. So a band that had nothing behind them, the best thing they had was Love Me Do, again, if they even wrote Love Me Do. Now all of a sudden, magically, has the skills and the expertise to pen and record 8 original compositions. Then, 8 months later, in November of 1963, their second release after Please Please Me with the Beatles was released on November 22nd, 1963. It's the same day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. 8 more original songs and 6 covers. So we have this band that has shown no indication or proof of songwriting skills. Their producer acknowledges that they didn't have any songs. And now all of a sudden, after June of 1962, after George Martin takes them in, 16 original songs pop out between the 2 albums, Please Please Me in March of 1963 and with the Beatles in November of 1963. And I can go on and on and on with this. Now, for somebody not to question this is amazing to me. Absolutely amazing to me. Just bring that chart up one more time, Billy. I want to go through that box in the bottom left in yellow because there's some important information there. If we use August of 1960, when the Beatles first arrived in Hamburg, as the stake in the ground and then move forward, here's the elapsed time. So again, they showed up in Hamburg, marginal musicians at best, a bar and club band and not a very good one, and they showed no indication of songwriting skills. Hamburg to the Decca audition. They did that in 1 year and 4 months. From Hamburg to the EMI contract in June of 1962, 1 year and 10 months. From Hamburg to the release of their Please Please Me album, 2 years and 7 months. So if we take a look at some of these dates, it's absolutely not believable. Hamburg to when they arrived in the United States, 3 years and 5 months, roughly 3.5 years. So this nondescript bar and club band in August of 1960 with no indication or proof of songwriting skills, finds themselves in America on February 7th of 1964 with 2 albums under their belt. So I don't know. Maybe it's just me, Billy, but there's a lot of questionable activity taking place. Now, I told you I'd talk about Phil Spector. There was an interview that was sent to me by one of my listeners, a very, very interesting interview, that Roy Carr from New Music Express, he interviewed Phil Spector in 1976. And that interview made its way into a music publication out of Australia called RAM, R-A-M.
Which is the title of Paul McCartney's first album as well.
It's interesting, right? And McCartney has his, it was his second release, his RAM album. In that interview, Phil Spector said he played a major role with the Beatles in the development of the Beatles. In fact, Phil Spector goes on to say that he was one of the main players in making the Beatles what they became. And he also said that, and Roy Carr acknowledges because Roy knew, Phil said, when they arrived in America on February 7th of 1964, was I not on that plane with them? So Roy Carr says, yeah, you were. And Phil goes on to say that he did all this work with the band. And he also went on to say, and if George Martin wants to take issue with it and he wants to talk to me, let's have a conversation.
He was officially involved with the Let It Be album, was he not?
Yes, it was. The story goes that my dogs are barking. I hope it's not too loud there. The story goes that John Lennon and George Harrison brought Spector in to work on the Let It Be album because John said that, and this is a quote from John, I'm going to paraphrase the quote, but he said that they handed Phil Spector a bunch of tapes or a bunch of shit, a pile of shit.
Yeah.
And he said, and Phil did a great job with it. He said it was the worst recordings ever. And so
he also done John Lennon's Imagine album as well.
He worked on Imagine, the Plastic Ono Band. He worked on All Things Must Pass. So he did a lot of work that he was credited with the Beatles post their Beatle career, from Let It Be on.
Yeah.
But apparently, according to Phil, before that, he was not credited, but he was highly and very involved with the band. Now, the reason why this is important is because Phil, his house band was the Wrecking Crew.
Yeah.
Okay, so that would mean that the Wrecking Crew, if we are to believe what Phil is saying in his interview from 1976, was involved in recording the Beatles' music. That, to me, is a logical step to take. If Phil Spector was involved with the Beatles like he said he was, and he was working with them, probably in tandem with George Martin, and his house band, his de facto house band was the Wrecking Crew.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. All we have to do is connect some very easy dots. And that's not to say that there weren't musicians back in the UK that were doing the session work too, like Big Jim Sullivan, Vic Flick. We had Ronnie Verrill.
Jimmy Page.
Jimmy Page, yeah. That's a good one. I'm glad you brought that up. I have a person that I know, I'm going fast here, folks, because I don't want to go past the 2 hours that Billy has allotted here, who knew Dan Peake, who was one of the founding members. He knew him really well. One of the founding members of the band America. And America was produced by George Martin as well. America was one of George Martin's bands. He wrote me. We had some email exchanges going back and forth. He told me that Dan told him that Jimmy Page played the lead guitar on I Saw Her Standing There. Okay?
Well, Jimmy Page himself, I'm sure I've read, he has admitted he was on some Beatles tracks.
Jimmy admitted to playing on Beatles albums in a post that he had on either Twitter or Instagram.
Yeah,
and people wanted to argue with me and say, no, he's probably talking about the U.S. release of A Hard Day's Night, which had some soundtrack music on it. But Jimmy didn't say he played on the soundtrack to the film. Jimmy said he played on the album. Yep. And that's a big difference. And that, the Hard Day's Night album out of the UK is 13 original, quote, compositions from the Beatles. So Jimmy Page is telling us what? That he was one of the musicians that played on the Hard Day's Night album. And then we have Bernard Purdy and the 21 tracks that he drummed on. And for all of those people that want to argue and say that, no, he drummed on the Tony Sheridan tracks, he did both. He drummed on the Tony Sheridan tracks. He was hired by Brian Epstein to put some more oomph and some more presence behind the drumming on those tracks for the U.S. market. And he also drummed on 21 Beatle tracks from the early albums. So when he talks about the early albums, we're talking about that period between 1962 and 66. I suspect that Bernard is talking about maybe the first 3 albums. Please Please Me with the Beatles and A Hard Day's Night. It could also go into later albums, but that's what I suspect. And people will say, well, can't believe Bernard because Bernard won't tell us the names of the songs. The reason why Bernard did not name the songs is because in an article, an interview that he had many years ago, he was asked about that. And he said, I'm not going to give the names of the songs because I need it as leverage to receive the compensation that I believe that I deserve today, considering where the Beatles went after I recorded those tracks. So when he first did those tracks, I think he said he was paid something like $10,000 to do the drumming, to fix the drum tracks on those songs. And then later on, he took a look at where the Beatles went. He's like, well, that's me drumming on it, and I got paid $10,000 for this stuff. So in a Martin Drummer interview, I think it was Martin Drummer going back a number of years ago, actually more than a number of years ago, a long while back, he said that their people, meaning the Beatles people, finally reached out to him and said they were going to make it right. So I think what happened was, taking a guess at this, it's probably a pretty good guess. They said to Bernard, look, we'll write you a big check, okay? But you keep your mouth shut about which songs they are. You can't talk about the songs. And so, Bernard doesn't talk about it anymore. So I think that what happened was he got the check. Bernard said, fine, I won't talk about the songs. Everybody goes home happy.
To be honest, that's a wee bit rich because a lot of these session musicians know exactly what they're getting into. They get paid for the job regardless of what goes on to do, but I guess he played his cards right.
Well, see, the way it works back in the day was these guys, even if you watch the documentary, The Wrecking Crew, they were going from gig to gig, recording these different songs. To them, it was just sitting down, getting the sheet music, and playing the music. I
think even a lot of them they were creating the bass lines and,
Yes. Yeah, Carol Kay, that bass line on Good Vibrations, that's her. Yeah. Guys like Glenn Campbell, who was with the Wrecking Crew, Glenn would go do his own thing. These guys were brilliant session musicians. They got the job done. Now, just quickly to wrap up on Rubber Soul, Billy, if that's okay?
Yep, sure.
Okay. So let's just put the chart up where I show the timeline. On the right-hand side, I list all the songs, October and November, and how quickly the Beatles got through those songs. Yeah, that's the one right there. So I'll finish with this slide. I had more slides, but unfortunately we're out of time. So there's 2 problems with Rubber Soul. One is 16 songs in 30 days is not possible. We're told that the Beatles did Rubber Soul between October 11th and November 11th of 1965, and they came into the studio empty with no songs. Some people want to argue that they had partial drafts of some of the songs, like Michelle, We Can Work It Out, What Goes On, and they brought Wade in from the basic rhythm tracks from the Help sessions earlier in 1965. But the thing is, there is no proof that they had partials of Michelle. There's no proof they had a partial draft of We Can Work It Out. And with What Goes On, the official narrative tells us that they kept the chorus, that the entire song otherwise was completely revamped. So if you're going to revamp a song, it essentially means you're rewriting it. Those are some of the songs that people throw out there to say that, it wasn't 16, Mike, it was something less. I believe it was 16 because I don't believe they wrote anything. That's why I say 16. In Mark Lewison's book, The Complete Beatles Chronicles, I think the book was published in the 1980s, he tells us that it was his other book. It was the recordings, the Beatles recordings. He tells us in that book that the Beatles had to write more than a dozen songs in that 30-day period. So Mark Lewison, who is considered the Beatle historian, is telling us they had to write more than a dozen songs, which means they had to write 13, 14, 15, or 16 songs. And I'm saying 16 because, like I said, I don't believe the official narrative at all. I don't think they came in with anything. Scott Fryman, who is the musicologist and the composer that is responsible for the Decomposing the Beatles documentaries in Rubber Soul, explains to us that they came in empty. Okay, so we have a lot of sources here. We have Beatles sources, official narrative sources that are telling us that they came in empty. Now, Billy, if we can go to the one I sent you earlier today, this is the official Beatles fan magazine called The Beatles Book. And it's the Beatles' own monthly magazine. And this is edition number 27 from October of 1965. this is what it tells us. They've got to write a whole new batch of numbers, including their next single, before the end of the month. They're talking about by the time they get to the end of November. On the plane coming back from America, so they had their tour in America in August of 1965, so they're going to return on August 31st. They were talking about it, and Paul said, now they're talking about writing the songs for the album, Rubber Soul. This is what Paul says about the Rubber Soul sessions. We have nothing up our sleeves at the moment. The cupboard is definitely bare. And then the article goes on with its fluff and says, but they have never let us down yet. And I know they won't this time either. So Paul McCartney, out of the horse's mouth, is saying they didn't have anything going into the Rubber Soul sessions. And for people that want to argue that they had 6 weeks in between when the tour ended and when they had to show up at EMI on October 11th of 65, in Mark Lewison's book, The Complete Beatles Chronicles, he tells us the Beatles had 6 weeks of vacation and no work, which means they weren't working on songs, which means they had to start the writing process when they got into EMI Studios on October 11th of 65, with the first day of recording being October 12th of 1965. So, Billy, if we can go back to the other chart with the you showed before with the dates. Yeah. All right, folks, a couple of things. In August of 1966, in a BBC interview, Paul said that for Revolver, it took them at least 2 weeks to try to get one song written. One song took weeks. Yet, we're to believe that 16 songs, or 12 songs, or 13, or 14, or 15 songs were written in 4 weeks. In that August 5th, 1966 BBC interview, which was the same date that Revolver was released, Paul says that we're limited as a group. We're the first to say we're not all that good musically. So how could a band that has, at that point with Revolver, 7 studio albums under their belt, being the brilliant band that they're supposed to be, how could they be limited as a group and not that good musically? For the Rubber Soul sessions, not one song took more than 5 takes to record the basic rhythm tracks. That number is ridiculous. If we fast forward to the White Album sessions in 1968, each song took dozens and dozens and dozens of takes to get it down. During that 30-day period, there were 6 days when there was no recording, and that was due to fan club obligations. That was 1 day. George Martin and Norman Smith had to mix. That was 2 days. They went out and received their MBEs from the Queen. That was 1 day. And they took 2 days out to do a TV show. In October, they recorded 8 songs in 18 days with a total of 28 takes. That's an average of 3.5 takes per song. In November, they did the remaining 8 songs because they did 16 songs for Rubber Soul. 8 songs were recorded in 13 days, in 5 less days, with a total of 14 takes for all of the songs. And that's an average of about 2 takes per song. So between October 11th and November 11th, 1965, 16 songs in 31 days, with a total of 42 takes for all of the songs, which is an average of 2.5 takes per song. So for anybody who is a songwriter, a musician, and has spent time in the studio recording, you know that those numbers are not even remotely close to reality. 8 of the songs were started and completed on the same day. So 8 of the 16 songs they started and completed on the very same day. And 4 songs were completed on the very last day of recording, on November 11th of 1965. Now, if we go to the calendar real quick, let me just show you how this rolled out. So the Beatles arrive on October 11th of 1965, and then the next day, Run for Your Life is in the bag. 1 day, boom, it's done. 2 days in, Drive My Car. 5 days in, Day Tripper's in the bag. Then 7 days in, If I Needed Someone is completed. Norwegian Wood, 10 days in My Life, 11 days in, along with Nowhere Man. So they finish up In My Life and Nowhere Man on the exact same day, on October 22nd. And We Can Work It Out, 18 days in. That's knocked out. So I won't go through November because it's the same story. If you take a look at the box at the bottom of the November chart, those are the 4 songs that they did on that last day that we're told. And 2 of those songs, You Won't See Me and Girl, we are told via the official narrative, did not exist until that day. So they had to write from scratch, rehearse, and record 2 songs on the last day, and then finish up Wait, which they had to do vocals and overdubs on. That was the song they brought in from Help. And then they had to do I'm Looking Through You, which we're told they originally started on November 6th, and they finished up on November 11th. Now, one more thing, Billy. If I Needed Someone is an interesting song because I think it was the Hollies. Yeah, it was the Hollies that did a cover of If I Needed Someone.
Just where we do that's quite interesting. In this article here, it says that they went to dub their voices for the performance at Shea Stadium.
Yes, that's right. Yes, that's another important piece. Let's get to that in a moment. But If I Needed Someone, we're told that the Beatles, they started the song and then completed the song on October 18th, 7 days in.
Right.
Okay? However, the Hollies also recorded If I Needed Someone and released their version of the song on the very same day that Rubber Soul was released, on December 3rd of 1965. And of course, Rubber Soul, one of the tracks was If I Needed Someone. So here's the question. How did the Hollies have access to the song if the Beatles were writing it? If George Harrison was allegedly writing that song, how did the Hollies have access to the song? Somebody might say, well, George wrote it and then he ran over to the next studio where the Hollies were recording and showed it to them. They learned it and come on. If you believe that story, I have a bridge I can tell you. The way this song got recorded by both bands and released on the same day, on December 3rd of 1965, was the song was pre-written and the instrumental tracks were pre-recorded. So the Hollies were doing the same thing that the Beatles were doing when the Beatles were in the studio for 30 days recording Rubber Soul, and that was to record the vocals. That's what was taking place. So a lot of people don't know that. That's kind of a little weird factoid about the song If I Needed Someone, that both bands recorded it apparently at the exact same time and released on the exact same day. And then, yes, if we go to, we'll finish up with this. Brian's plan to film the Beatles' performance at Shea Stadium in America was a great success, and I hope that you will be able to see the finished result very soon. Some of the sounds were not quite right, and the boys will have to dub on their voices in the bits where the screaming prevented their vocals from being recorded. This is very important because I've been telling people for the longest time that these recordings that you see on YouTube, many of these recordings have been edited and overdubbed post-production.
Yeah.
Because back in the day, they had 2-track recorders. And with all of that screaming, let me just explain this. If the vocals got washed out with all that screaming, then also there was going to be bleed into the microphones of the bass and the guitars. Anything that was mic'd, the drums, was going to have that screaming going through their microphones. And it was going to be bleed through. That goes back to my point that these videos that people keep pointing to and saying, oh, look, listen to the sound quality, listen to how good they sound. That stuff was fixed up afterwards. And many times in smaller venues, the Beatles were playing to a backing track. The Beatles played on the Ed Sullivan Show, they played to a backing track. It's like the Dave Clark 5. They were on the Ed Sullivan Show, and I have a clip where the backing track failed. And they were standing there, okay, there's no music. Nobody shows up on these types of venues, the Ed Sullivan Show, without a backing track. There's too much invested. There's too much money invested. There's too much PR invested. There's too much marketing invested. You can't afford to have a failure. You can't afford to have the band fall on its face. So sorry I had to race through the back end of this thing, but hopefully people will get what I'm talking about and just go to my website, Sage of Quay, SageOfQuay, sageofquay.com, and you can go to my Polish Dead channel and you can see all my research there.
That's great, Mike. It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much for coming on the show again. We'll hook up again sometime.
Thank you, Billy. Thank you so much.
Cheers now, folks. Thanks for watching. Cheers now.